Welcome to Human Rights in Conversation, the first in a series of interviews that explore human rights close to home. I'm Michael Buckley, the director of Lehman College's Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies, and I'm here with journalism students Victoria Moran Garcia and Jovan Figueroa, who will be conducting today's interview. We're joined by Maria Imperial, whose career has been dedicated to advancing justice in New York. She is currently the vice president of the Barbara McDowell Public Interest Law Center, and prior to that served as commissioner of the New York State Division of Human Rights. We're honored to have her with us for a conversation that seems only more relevant and urgent than when we originally scheduled it.
Hello, welcome to Lehman.
Hello, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so honored to be the inaugural guest.
Okay, so my first question for you is, why human rights?
Oh boy. As Michael said, almost now more than ever, we need to focus on human rights and take a human rights approach. And a lot of time when you hear human rights, you think of international struggles or things in far-off countries, but human rights are extremely local, and human rights means recognizing our basic humanity and treating each person, because we are human, with dignity and respect. And as I said, now more than ever, we almost have the antithesis of human rights going on.
So, I think a lot of listeners may hear human rights and think of some struggle halfway around the world. How do human rights issues play out right here close to home?
Well, I have this quote that I always loved, but then once I became the commissioner of the State Division of Human Rights, I always reminded people of it. And the quote is from Eleanor Roosevelt, and I would be remiss in not shouting out that Lehman College was the first United Nations site. And actually, Eleanor Roosevelt was here and worked on the International Declaration of Human Rights. And I didn't know that until I started preparing for this podcast. And I was really blown away thinking of the history that takes place here on this campus and seeing the connection with human rights and peace. So the Eleanor Roosevelt quote that I love is, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home." And that is so true, because it's really in the neighborhoods where human rights begin.
And so for listeners who aren't familiar, can you tell us about New York State Division of Human Rights and what it does?
Sure. I'm very proud, and we all should be very proud, that New York State was actually the first state in the country to pass a human rights law, and it was passed in 1945, so it actually preceded the International Declaration of Human Rights. And we were the first state in the country to create an office to enforce those rights, because if you can't have enforcement, the right is not significant. So it started addressing employment discrimination in 1945. Those were the beginning cases. But throughout the years, our human rights law has expanded, and it is really such a beautiful law. And New York is really at the forefront of adding bases for discrimination and also classes that are covered by the human rights law. So if somebody, the first step is just knowledge. I mean, that's a human rights principle. People need to know what their rights are. So if somebody feels like they are discriminated, they can file a complaint. And something that I am very proud of is that as part of a transparency initiative at the Division of Human Rights, we instituted an online complaint form. And so people can now go online and fill out a complaint. You don't need an attorney to represent you, and you describe what the basis of your claim is, and then every single claim is addressed by the New York State Division of Human Rights.
And can you talk to us about how the division's work has shifted over time?
Yes. The division, well, we have so many more. The downside, if you will, of the electronic complaint is that there has been almost an explosion because I'm proud that we've removed the barrier to people filing complaints, but by removing that barrier, there's so many more complaints. So last year was the highest amount of complaints to the New York State Division of Human Rights. There were 8,000 complaints. But in terms of my particular agenda, if you will, I had a very different agenda at the Division of Human Rights. And I know when I first became commissioner, I was given a badge. And I was kind of confused by why I had a badge. I was proud of it, but I was confused why I had a badge. And then I realized, well, the Division of Human Rights is looked upon as a law enforcement agency. And I was a little troubled by that. I think there definitely needs to be accountability. There needs to be law enforcement. But I very much believe in a restorative justice approach. So I wanted to shift the paradigm at Division of Human Rights and have the division focus on restoring humanity. And at the same time, I became commissioner during the latter part of the COVID period, and during COVID, we saw such discrimination in the Asian American community. Then we had George Floyd happening. Then we had Buffalo, the massacre in the Buffalo supermarket. And then we have October 7th, anti-Semitism, and then we have anti-Muslim. So during my tenure, we really focused on the rise of hate, and we created a division of a unit on hate and bias prevention unit. And I would say that that was really the biggest change, that we tried to start focusing on prevention and restoration and healing in addition to law enforcement.
So, as you mentioned, a lot of key points. And when we think about the topic of human rights, that is a wide subject, right? And when we think about human rights, the foundation, which is based on the Constitution, and human rights include access to health, access to housing, access to food, security, equal protection of law. So going into the next question, what was the issue that took most of your attention and energy when you were there?
I would say the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit, and starting the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit. The governor had in her State of the State, declared that the Human Rights Division would create this Hate and Bias Prevention Unit. So we had to start it from scratch. And I did look to human rights principles, if you will, in setting up the unit. And what I meant by that is one of the principles of human rights is participation and empowerment. So we created 10 regional councils across the state. And the first part of the journey was going to those regions and just listening to the issues people were dealing with. So listening was a very important part of beginning the regional councils for the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit. Then we created a rapid response team so that if there was an incident, we would deploy a team to go to try to, again, address the harm that was facing the community. We also created a youth initiative that I'm very proud of. And we also launched a public service campaign on telling people you belong here.
Can you tell us a bit about your time as commissioner? What did you hope to accomplish, and what are you most proud of having set in motion?
Sure. As I mentioned before, I think I'm proudest of creating the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit because it really embodied human rights principles. It was a bottom-up approach. and we listened. We tried to address the different each region was different. So each region maybe wanted to take a different approach to addressing hate and bias in their region. We viewed ourselves as facilitators. I remember saying we're like setting the table for you and providing you with the tools so that you can create a community-based response to hate and bias prevention. We also had the first Unity Summit in the state where we invited all the members of the 10 regions. It actually took place at John Jay College, and there were over 500 people there. We had clergy, we had government people, we had local people, education, youth workers. So it was just a wonderful diversity of people listening to how hate is impacting us and what we might be able to do together collectively. And there's something I always love to say when I was at the YWCA, and it stays with me. I always say, strong alone, fearless together. And I felt like each region was different, but then bringing the regions together at the Unity Summit was creating such a powerful force. And the force was for love. I remember talking about love. The lieutenant governor also talked about love, and not love in the romantic sense, but love as a force, like Martin Luther King talked about the beloved community. And so that's what we were trying to create. So in addition to the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit, which also had the youth component, the public service campaign, and also the rapid response team, I also created a sexual harassment hotline. And there were lots of issues that rose to the surface in New York, and that's actually how the governor took office, due to a sexual harassment incident and the Me Too movement. So increasingly we were seeing sexual harassment complaints, and so we created a hotline where people could call, and then we would, because the division had to stay neutral, we couldn't advise people on their complaints, but we referred them to pro bono attorneys to help them with their complaint. And then I think the third thing I would say is also creating the Disability Rights Council. And people are surprised to hear that the largest number of complaints we received at the division was actually in the disability area. So that was the largest number of complaints. So we created a Disability Rights Council of the disability advocates across the state. We met monthly, and one thing I learned, which is definitely a human rights mantra, is nothing about us without us, and that really comes from the disability field. So I would say those were the three main projects or new initiatives that I launched that I'm particularly proud of.
And do you remember when you were first introduced to the concept of seeing issues of justice and injustice through a human rights lens?
I didn't have the words. I didn't have the words to say this is a human rights issue, or I need to use a human rights lens to this problem. But I had shared with Michael that in so many ways I feel like I'm coming home today, because I grew up in this area. And my mom actually worked in this very building in Carmen Hall in Lehman College as an administrative assistant, and then she ultimately became a teacher. And then when I went on to college, I thought I wanted to do urban planning because I love neighborhoods, and I always think there was a thread of building community in my professional career. So after college, I had an urban fellowship, and I worked at the Department of City Planning in the South Bronx. And during that time, there was a lot of devastation in the South Bronx, and I thought that was where I could learn the most about city planning and renovation. And I came from the community. I went back to the community, but one thing I learned, and probably this is the first time I was exposed to a human rights approach or needing to take a human rights approach is I realized that the people who were on the planning commission were not planners and they were not community advocates, but they were attorneys who knew what the law was and kind of how the law could be manipulated or used as a tool. So I decided at that point that I wanted to go to law school, and I didn't have a clear plan, and I tell this to all young people because everyone thinks, oh, you need to know, and I really did not know. I didn't have a plan, except that I knew that I wanted to bring about some kind of change, and because I saw what was going on in the Bronx, and I felt like we needed to hear the voices of people who lived in the Bronx and have them have input into the planning process. So I think that was probably the first time where I was seeing a human rights issue and feeling like we need to take a human rights approach.
And can you tell us some more about how your experience growing up in the Bronx influenced the way you think about these issues?
Sure. Well, my mom is Latina. She's from Nicaragua. And not many people knew where Nicaragua was when I was growing up, and my father was Italian, and we weren't always welcomed, let's say, by the Italians, the Italian side, because we were half and half. I describe myself as cafe con leche. So there were issues related to there were like ethnic issues where didn't necessarily feel discriminated against, but I felt like people were looking at me differently. So now I'm forgetting what your question.
How did growing up in the Bronx influence how you?
Okay. So the other thing is, though, I grew up in a neighborhood where I felt very supportive. I lived next door to my grandmother lived with us. I lived next door to my grandparents. So I feel like a wonderful, warm foundation and always felt supported. And I realize now that not everybody has that blessing. And for me, that was a blessing. And I always wanted to try to recreate that feeling of community and feeling like you belong throughout my career.
Before becoming New York State's Human Rights Commissioner, you had a long career in nonprofits, and now you are working in philanthropy. Is that human rights work too?
Oh, yes, of course. Now I could, looking back, I could say that is human rights work. So I went to a law firm after law school because I had to pay off my law school loans. And so I went to a law firm, and it was actually a wonderful experience. I got very good training there. I don't regret going to the law firm. But I knew that's not why I went to law school. I went to law school because I wanted to do impact change. So I saw a job posting in the New York Times looking for a director of community services at this organization called Victim Services, which is now the largest victim services organization in the country. And I applied for the job. I didn't get that job. The person who hired me, Lucy Friedman, who became a mentor of mine, said, you really don't have the experience. I didn't have the experience. I wasn't a social worker. But she said, would you consider being my special assistant? So I said, yes, I would consider being your special assistant. And my job had like 3 parts. Part of it was creating an immigrant rights law project. We were creating an immigrants' rights project. The second was doing her speeches. And the third was creating a school-based domestic violence curriculum. And I'm going back, like 30 years now. So we were really on the cutting edge. And I learned about domestic violence there. I didn't know about domestic violence. And women's rights are definitely human rights, and domestic violence is an issue that should be addressed as a human rights issue as well. So I created a domestic violence law project when I was at Safe Horizon. And again, that was a wonderful experience. And then from there, I was there 10 years, and then I had my children, and I wanted to then I went to the City Bar Association, where I created the City Bar Justice Center. And at the City Bar Justice Center, we leveraged pro bono lawyers in all different areas. And again, they say timing is everything. I went there right when 9/11 happened, and there were so many lawyers who wanted to volunteer, so we had to harness the energy of the lawyers, and we created it was one of the largest, emergency response law project, and we appointed each family that was impacted by 9/11 with an attorney who served as a facilitator, and because they had so many multiple needs, they had family law issues, trusts and estates, just employment. So we created the 9/11 project there. So that was also a human rights issue. And then from the city bar, I wanted to move closer to home because I had children, and I wanted to try find a better work-life balance, although, frankly, there is no such thing as work-life balance. I wish there was. But I went to work at the YWCA, and the YWCA, I knew that the YWCA was a women's organization, but I really didn't know that much about the YWCA until I was applying for the job. And then when I applied for the job, I saw that the mission of the YWCA is actually dual. It's empowering women and eliminating racism. So it was really the eliminating racism, which is a human rights issue as well, that brought me to the YWCA. And it was from looking at racism as a human rights issue that made me even more interested in human rights. So it was kind of fortuitous when the governor's office called me when I was at the YWCA, where I created a center for racial empowerment, and was again looking at racism as a human rights issue. And they asked me if I would be interested in becoming the commissioner, which at that point, because I was very much looking at issues through a human rights lens, that I thought it would be a great next step. And now I'm at the Barbara McDowell Social Justice Center. And again, I feel like I've come full circle because I started my career as an attorney, and now I am I'm in the twilight of my career at the Barbara McDowell Social Justice Center. And the Barbara McDowell Social Justice Center litigates, advocates, educates, and we also provide grants to groups bringing impact litigation. So you can't have peace, you can't have human rights without having justice. So the Barbara McDowell Social Justice Center, it's the only one of its kind in the country, empowers people to bring class action litigations to enforce their rights.
Nice. Okay, so my next question is, a lot of people are really alarmed by the rapid shifts in government policy we've seen in the second Trump administration so far. What are the human rights implications?
Well, I had said in the beginning that I feel like it's almost the antithesis of human rights. It's what we're going through right now. But I also said that all human rights, like Eleanor Roosevelt's, begins at a local level. So the part that upsets me the most is that I heard somebody describe it this way, that in America we're treating this disease of hate or authoritarianism as if it was a virus. But it's really not a virus, it's an autoimmune disease. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, wow, that is so true, because I'm a little Pollyanna-ish, but I was surprised at the results of the election. I guess I was surprised because I didn't realize there were so many people that were supportive of that ideology. But just the same way, what I want to commit myself now to is trying to have community conversation around this issue so that people can start talking to each other and supporting each other without seeing each other as the enemy. Somebody had mentioned about a circle, that this podcast is kind of like a circle, and I went through circle training through the Center for Dispute Resolution at the state, and so something I'm interested in doing, and what they do is create circles. So, and you learn about mediation and conflict resolution. And so I just think, what if we overpower this hate with love?
And who do you think is the most affected by this autoimmune disease, and who would benefit the most from that circle?
Oh, well, it's the community. It's the community. It's the people who are hurt the most are definitely the marginalized people. And again, taking a human rights approach, the human rights approach, and why this is an antithesis of a human rights approach, is that in a human rights approach, you look out for the most marginalized group. And we have almost the exact opposite going on here, where there's more attention being placed and advancement being considered of the people that have the most privilege. So there's something wrong with that equation. So I would say the most marginalized have the most to lose right now, but we all win in a society where there's love. So I think that in terms of turning around, I don't think people want to live with hate. This hatred, it's you can't even have a conversation at a Thanksgiving dinner. So we have to address that, and I think everybody will benefit from learning to speak to each other, treat, and it's very basic. I mean, it's not a faraway place. It's basic here. You respect each other's human dignity.
And right now, it can be overwhelming to keep up with the breakneck pace of President Trump and Elon Musk's. So it can be overwhelming to keep up with the breakneck pace of President Trump and Elon Musk's pronounced. Oh my God.
That's okay. We'll just chalk that out.
So right now,
It's hard to say. It's a K plus an S.
pronouncements. It can be overwhelming to keep up with the breakneck pace of President Trump and Elon Musk's pronouncements, which is maybe part of their strategy. What do you think we should be paying attention to?
I'm so impressed by this program and that the two of you are in this journalism field. And what I was thinking when you were giving me a tour of this place, and this maybe is just the most recent of what's happening, but the attacks on the press, it is so scary to me. Now they want to only have select reporters asking questions. So the press influences a lot of us. So I guess you're asking me today, and we just had that happen yesterday. So just thinking about like Joy Reid, for example, like now she's canceled. And so people capitulating to trying to be more balanced. So I fear the attacks on the press.
How can academic institutions like Lehman College's Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies be most supportive to people on the front lines, advancing and protecting human rights?
Oh, there's so many ways that a college and students could get involved in the movement. There's research that has to be done. There's partnerships, internships. I think you need to talk to each other. I don't know if there's something similar here, like the circle that I was talking about, but where youth, college students, learn how to mediate, conflict resolution. I think I mentioned partnerships, but I think that the college, we had colleges on our regional council, and they were very much involved again in conflict mediation in their region. Advocacy training. There could, if it was, I know you don't have a law program here, but if there was a law program, there could be a collaboration of maybe doing some kind of like paralegal where we did a joint law clinic. So I think there are so many ways that youth and colleges could get involved in the struggle for human rights.
Okay, and at this time of crisis, what role can universities and university leadership play?
Well, it's hard to show courage. And the person that I see in the mirror, sometimes I wish that I could be more courageous. But leadership at the university has to be a leader and has to be strong and courageous. So now I know all the universities are struggling around the executive order around DEI. So I think I don't have the answer to that, but it's a dilemma because colleges face losing their funding, their federal funding, if they don't comply with this. So that now I'm going back to the Barbara McDowell social justice, and that's why you need litigation. You need the tools to be able to fight against these edicts. So I would say my advice to universities is to be strong and to be aware of what their legal rights are and to fight for what they believe in.
A lot of our students are really frightened, but also sort of frozen. What are the lessons from previous human rights movements that they can draw on for what they are facing today?
That's a good question, because sometimes even I don't realize like the trauma that people are facing, and I do think that that's real. I do think it's definitely real that people are afraid of ICE. And there's a lot of trauma among students. So I would say from past movements, again, creating a community and supporting each other and reaching out for help too. I think that there's more at COVID we learned about just the mental health crisis that we have. I think there are more mental health resources around, but we have to think of during this time also self-care. I know I pointed out to you, I said, oh, there's a wellness center here, which is great. So maybe make sure that people take care of themselves and that we support each other.
And what are you currently focusing on?
Okay, so I mentioned that I'm a vice president at the Barbara McDowell Social Justice Center. And, throughout my life, I've worked for women who I really have learned so much from and see as mentors. And I learned about Barbara McDowell, who passed away, but she was an incredible advocate. She argued 2 cases before the Supreme Court in one day, and she was a real fighter. And her husband, Jerry Hartman, created this foundation in her honor. So I, again, I'm grateful to be at the Barbara McDowell Social Justice Center, and we're using the law as a tool to make change.
Thank you so much, Maria Imperial, for joining us here for the Lehman College Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies Spring Interview. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed so much speaking with you as well, and wish you both the best of luck.